The morning mist hung heavy over Buckingham Palace as Sergeant William Hayes began his usual patrol around the royal quarters. He had been serving as a royal guard for 15 years, and nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he would witness that Tuesday morning in October. Camilla had been struggling with the pressures of royal life for months. The constant scrutiny from the media, the endless formal events, and the weight of public expectations had begun to take their toll. She felt trapped in a golden cage, unable to live the simple life she had once known. The recent negative press coverage about her spending habits and public appearances had pushed her to a breaking point. That morning, she had made a desperate decision. She could no longer bear the suffocating routine of royal duties. The upcoming state dinner with foreign dignitaries felt like the final straw. She needed to escape, even if it was just for a few days, to find some peace and remember who she was before the crown changed everything. Camilla had carefully planned her departure. She packed a small bag with essential items, including personal jewelry that held sentimental value, some cash she had been saving, and a few photographs from her younger days. She avoided her usual designer clothes, choosing instead simple jeans and a plain sweater that would help her blend in with ordinary people. The plan was to slip out through the lesser-used East Wing exit during the morning guard change. She had studied the patrol schedules and knew there would be a brief window when that particular corridor would be unmonitored. Her heart raced as she made her way through the familiar halls that now felt like prison corridors. As she approached the exit, Camilla thought about the letter she had left on her dressing table. In it, she had tried to explain her feelings to Charles, hoping he would understand her need for space and time away from the overwhelming responsibilities. She wasn't abandoning her duties forever, she told herself, just taking a much-needed break. The heavy door came into view, and for a moment, freedom seemed within reach. She imagined walking through London streets unrecognized, sitting in a small cafe reading a book, or simply watching people live their normal lives without the burden of royal protocol. These simple pleasures, which most people took for granted, had become impossible dreams for her. But as her hand reached for the door handle, she heard footsteps echoing behind her in the marble corridor. Her heart sank as she realized her carefully planned escape might be about to unravel. The sound grew closer, and she knew there was no turning back now. Whatever happened next would change everything for both her and the person approaching behind her. Sergeant Hayes had noticed something unusual during his morning round. A door that was normally locked stood slightly ajar, and there had been faint sounds coming from areas that should have been empty at this early hour. His training kicked in, and he decided to investigate, never imagining he would soon find himself in the middle of a royal crisis that would test his loyalty, discretion, and understanding of duty versus compassion. Sergeant Hayes turned the corner and froze in disbelief. There stood Camilla, the queen consort, dressed in casual clothes with a travel bag slung over her shoulder, her hand on the exit door handle. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in a suspended moment that seemed to stretch forever. Camilla's face showed a mixture of fear, embarrassment, and desperation. She had been so close to freedom, and now her carefully planned escape was crumbling before her eyes. She looked at Hayes, a man she had seen countless times during official functions but had never really spoken to personally. His expression showed shock, but also something else she couldn't quite identify. "Your Majesty," Hayes said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The formal address felt strange in this unexpected situation. He had been trained to handle security threats, protocol violations, and emergency situations, but nothing in his manual covered what to do when you discovered a member of the royal family trying to leave the palace secretly. Camilla straightened her shoulders, trying to regain some composure despite being caught in such a vulnerable moment. "Sergeant Hayes," she replied, remembering his name from the many times she had passed him in the corridors. "I suppose this looks rather unusual." Her voice carried a forced lightness, but the tremor in it revealed her emotional state. Hayes found himself in an impossible position. His duty was clear. He should immediately report this situation to his superiors and prevent any unauthorized departure from the palace. But looking at Camilla, he saw not the formal royal figure he was used to protecting, but a woman who appeared deeply troubled and desperate for something he couldn't quite understand. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" he asked, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. His years of service had taught him to read people, and everything about Camilla's posture and expression told him she was in distress. The bag in her hand, Her casual clothes and the early morning timing all pointed to a planned departure that was meant to be secret. Camilla looked into his eyes and saw genuine concern rather than judgment. For the first time in months, someone was looking at her as a person rather than a royal obligation. The kindness in his expression nearly brought tears to her eyes. "I just need some time away, Sergeant. Some space to breathe and think clearly." The honesty in her voice caught Hayes off guard. He had always seen the royal family as distant figures who lived lives of privilege and comfort. The idea that one of them could feel trapped or overwhelmed had never occurred to him. But here was Camilla, looking more human and vulnerable than he had ever imagined possible. Hayes glanced around the empty corridor, knowing that other guards would soon be making their rounds. Whatever decision he made in the next few minutes would have consequences he couldn't fully predict. He thought about his oath of service, his duty to protect the royal family, and his own moral compass pulling him in different directions. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "perhaps we should talk about this. There might be other ways to address whatever is troubling you." His suggestion was gentle but firm, showing that while he understood her distress, he couldn't simply let her walk out of the palace without at least trying to find an alternative solution. Camilla looked at Sergeant Hayes with a mixture of surprise and relief. In all her years of royal life, no one had ever asked her to simply talk about her problems. Everyone around her seemed to assume that her position came with automatic happiness and fulfillment. The fact that this guard was offering to listen meant more to her than he could possibly know. "You wouldn't understand," she said softly, her grip loosening slightly on the door handle. "No one really understands what it's like to live every moment of your life under scrutiny, to have every word analyzed and every action criticized. I feel like I'm disappearing under the weight of expectations." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. While he couldn't claim to understand the specific pressures of royal life, he had seen enough human suffering in his years of service to recognize genuine pain when he saw it. "Perhaps you're right that I can't fully understand, ma'am. But I do know what it feels like to feel trapped by duty and obligation." His words surprised Camilla. She had never considered that the people who served the royal family might have their own struggles with duty and purpose. She studied his face more carefully, seeing lines of experience and wisdom she had never noticed before during their brief, formal interactions. "I left a letter for Charles," she continued, as if the words were pouring out of her after being held back for too long. "I tried to explain that I'm not abandoning my responsibilities forever. I just need time to find myself again, to remember who I was before all of this became my life." Hayes listened carefully, understanding now that this wasn't a reckless escape attempt, but a desperate cry for help from someone who felt she had nowhere else to turn. He thought about his own family, his own moments of doubt about his career choices, and the times he had wanted to simply walk away from everything. "Ma'am, running away might give you temporary relief," he said gently, "but it won't solve the underlying problems, and it could create new ones that might be even harder to handle." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What if there was another way to get the space you need without causing a crisis?" Camilla looked at him with curiosity. For the first time since she had started planning her escape, someone was offering her an alternative rather than simply telling her what she couldn't do. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice showing the first hint of hope she had felt in weeks. Hayes thought quickly. His training had taught him to assess situations and find solutions under pressure, but this was unlike any crisis he had faced before. "Perhaps we could arrange for you to have some private time, some space within the palace grounds where you could be alone with your thoughts without the formal obligations." The suggestion wasn't perfect, but it showed Camilla that Hayes was genuinely trying to help her, rather than simply stopping her escape. She felt a spark of possibility that maybe there was a middle ground between complete escape and the suffocating routine she had been trapped in. "But the schedule," she said, thinking about the endless list of appointments and obligations that filled every day. "There's always something. Always someone who needs me to be somewhere doing something. Being someone I'm not sure I know how to be anymore." Hayes could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of years of pressure that had built up to this breaking point. He realized that this moment was about much more than preventing an unauthorized departure from the palace. It was about helping a human being who was drowning in responsibilities and expectations that had become unbearable. As they stood in the quiet corridor, Hayes made a decision that went against his training but felt right in his heart. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you to come with me, but not to report this incident immediately. Would you be willing to trust me for just a short while? Camilla studied his face, seeing sincerity and compassion that she hadn't expected. After months of feeling like everyone around her was either judging her performance or managing her image, here was someone who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being as a person. What do you have in mind, Sergeant? Hayes gently reached out his hand toward her bag. First, I'm afraid I'll need to hold on to your belongings temporarily. It's part of my duty to secure any situation that could be seen as a security concern, but I promise you this isn't about punishment or control. Reluctantly, Camilla handed over her bag. Inside were the few precious items she had chosen for her escape. A small jewelry box with her grandmother's ring, some cash, photographs from her youth, and a worn copy of a poetry book that had always brought her comfort. These simple objects represented her desire to connect with her authentic self, away from the formal roles and expectations. Hayes accepted the bag with care, understanding that he was holding items that were deeply meaningful to her. "Thank you for trusting me with these," he said. "Now, would you be willing to walk with me to a quieter part of the palace where we can continue talking without interruption?" As they walked together through the familiar corridors, Camilla felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time in months, someone was walking beside her rather than behind her in formal protocol. The conversation felt natural and genuine, unlike the careful diplomatic exchanges that filled most of her days. "You know," she said as they walked, "I used to love mornings like this. Before all the responsibilities, I would wake up early just to enjoy the quiet and think my own thoughts. Now every morning begins with briefings and schedules and people telling me what I need to accomplish." Hayes led her to a small sitting room in a less formal part of the palace, one typically used by staff during breaks. It was simple and comfortable, with worn furniture and windows that looked out onto a peaceful garden. "This isn't very grand," he apologized, "but it's quiet and private." Camilla sat down in one of the simple chairs and felt more relaxed than she had in any of the elaborate royal sitting rooms. "It's perfect," she said honestly. "It feels real." She looked around the room, noticing details she would never see in her formal quarters: a coffee cup left from the previous day, a newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle, evidence of normal people living normal lives. Hayes sat across from her, still holding her bag but treating it with obvious respect. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I'm not trying to trap you or make your situation worse, but I also can't pretend I didn't see what I saw this morning. What I can do is try to help you find a better solution." For the first time in their conversation, Camilla smiled genuinely. "You're very kind, Sergeant Hayes. I'm beginning to understand why Charles speaks so highly of the palace guards. You're not just protectors of our physical safety, are you?" Hayes returned her smile. "We're trained to protect in many ways, ma'am. Sometimes that means protecting people from external threats, and sometimes it means protecting them from making decisions they might regret later, when they're thinking more clearly." Camilla nodded, beginning to understand that Hayes wasn't her captor, but potentially her ally. She felt the desperate urgency of her escape plan beginning to fade, replaced by curiosity about what alternative he might suggest. For the first time in months, she felt like someone was truly listening to her concerns, rather than simply managing them. In the quiet comfort of the staff sitting room, Camilla found herself opening up in ways she hadn't been able to with anyone for months. "The hardest part," she confided to Hayes, "is feeling like I've lost myself completely. Every day, I wake up and put on this royal persona, but I'm not sure there's anything of the real me left underneath it all." Hayes listened intently, understanding that she was sharing something deeply personal. He had seen many people in crisis during his years of service, but he had never expected to find himself counseling a member of the royal family. "What was the real you like, ma'am? Before all the royal responsibilities?" Camilla's eyes brightened slightly as she thought back to her earlier life. "I loved gardening with my own hands, not just ceremonial plantings. I enjoyed reading mystery novels instead of briefing papers. I could have spontaneous conversations with friends without worrying about how every word might be interpreted by the media." As she spoke, Hayes began to understand the depth of her loss. She wasn't just struggling with busy schedules or public pressure. She was grieving for a version of herself that had been gradually erased by royal obligations. "Those things sound important to you," he said. "Have you been able to talk to anyone else about feeling this way?" "Who would I talk to?" Camilla asked with a bitter laugh. Charles has his own pressures and responsibilities. The staff are always professional and polite, but they're not friends. And I can't exactly call up old friends to complain about how difficult it is to be royal. They wouldn't understand, and it would sound ungrateful. Hayes realized that despite being surrounded by people all the time, Camilla was profoundly isolated. The very position that gave her privilege and status had also cut her off from genuine human connection. "That does sound incredibly lonely," he said simply. The acknowledgement of her loneliness seemed to release something in Camilla. Tears began to form in her eyes as she continued. "The worst part is feeling guilty about feeling this way. I know how fortunate I am, how many opportunities I have to do good things, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm failing at everything. I'm not the royal figure people expect me to be, and I'm not the person I used to be either." Hayes thought carefully about how to respond. His training had taught him crisis intervention techniques, but this situation required more than standard protocols. "Ma'am, it sounds like you're grieving for the life you had before, while also trying to build a new identity in a very challenging role. That's not failing. That's human." Camilla looked at him with surprise. No one had ever suggested that her struggles were normal human responses to extraordinary circumstances. Everyone around her seemed to expect that she should adapt seamlessly to royal life, as if her previous identity should simply disappear without any emotional consequences. "I brought some personal items with me this morning," she said, gesturing toward the bag Hayes was holding. "Things that remind me of who I was before. I thought maybe if I could just get away for a while and reconnect with those memories, I could figure out how to be both the person I was and the person I need to be now." Hayes nodded understandingly. "Those items are important to you," he said. "They represent parts of yourself that you don't want to lose." He paused thoughtfully. What if there was a way to honor both parts of yourself without having to choose between them? For the first time since their conversation began, Camilla looked genuinely hopeful. "What do you mean?" she asked, leaning forward with interest. Hayes realized he was about to suggest something that went well beyond his usual duties, but he felt compelled to help this woman who had been struggling alone for so long. "What if we could create some space in your regular life for the person you used to be? Small moments of authenticity that don't require you to abandon your royal responsibilities?" Hayes could see that Camilla was genuinely interested in his suggestion, so he continued carefully. "Ma'am, what if we could arrange for you to have regular private time in spaces like this one? Not for official duties, but just for yourself. You could read your mystery novels, tend to a small private garden, or simply sit quietly without anyone expecting you to be on all the time." Camilla's expression showed a mixture of hope and skepticism. "But the schedules, the obligations, there's always something that needs the royal presence. Every hour of every day seems to be accounted for by someone else." "That's true," Hayes acknowledged, "but even the most demanding schedules have small gaps. And perhaps some of those obligations could be reorganized to create larger spaces for personal time. It would require cooperation from your staff, but if they understood how important this is for your well-being, they might be willing to help." As they talked, Hayes began to understand that Camilla's attempted escape wasn't really about leaving forever. It was about finding a way to be authentic within the constraints of royal life. She needed to feel like a real person, not just a public figure performing a role. "There's something else," Hayes said thoughtfully. "Your belongings that you packed this morning, they're not just random items. They're pieces of your identity that you were trying to protect. What if we could find ways to incorporate those meaningful elements into your daily life here?" Camilla looked at the bag he was holding, thinking about the contents that represented her authentic self. "My grandmother's ring is in there," she said softly. "I stopped wearing it because it didn't match the formal jewelry expected for royal events. But it connects me to my family history in a way that feels more real than any crown jewels." Hayes smiled gently. "There's no reason you couldn't wear your grandmother's ring during your private time, or even with some of your official outfits. Personal meaning doesn't have to be sacrificed for royal protocol." For the first time since the morning began, Camilla laughed, a genuine, spontaneous sound that surprised them both. "You're right," she said. "I've been so focused on doing everything correctly that I forgot I could make some choices about how to blend my old self with my new role." Hayes realized they were making real progress. Instead of simply preventing an escape, They were working together to find sustainable solutions to the underlying problems that had driven her to that desperate point. Ma'am, would you be willing to talk to Prince Charles about some of these ideas? Not as a formal meeting, but as a conversation between two people who care about each other. Camilla considered the suggestion. She had been so focused on her own struggles that she hadn't considered that Charles might also have insights or solutions to offer. I've been afraid to burden him with my problems, she admitted. He has so many responsibilities of his own. But perhaps he's also noticed that you've been struggling, Hayes suggested gently. And maybe he would welcome the chance to help you find ways to be happier in your role. After all, your well-being affects not just you, but everyone who cares about you. Camilla nodded slowly, beginning to see her situation from a different perspective. Instead of feeling trapped and isolated, she was starting to understand that there might be people willing to help her create a more sustainable balance between her public duties and her personal needs. Sergeant Hayes, she said, I want you to know that this conversation has meant more to me than you probably realize. For the first time in months, I feel like someone has actually listened to me, rather than just trying to manage me. Hayes felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that his decision to treat the situation with compassion, rather than rigid protocol, had led to a meaningful breakthrough. They still had practical matters to address, but the crisis had transformed into an opportunity for positive change. As their conversation drew to a close, Hayes carefully returned Camilla's bag to her. Ma'am, I believe these belongings represent hopes and dreams that deserve to be part of your life, not hidden away or abandoned. Perhaps instead of using them to escape from your royal duties, you could use them to enrich those duties with personal meaning. Camilla accepted the bag with gratitude, understanding now that the items inside weren't tools for escape, but rather anchors to help her stay grounded in her authentic self while fulfilling her royal role. You've helped me see that I don't have to choose between being genuine and being royal, she said. Maybe I can find ways to be both. Hayes stood up, knowing that they would soon need to return to the regular routines of palace life, but feeling confident that this crisis had been transformed into an opportunity for positive change. Ma'am, I hope you'll consider speaking with Prince Charles about some of the ideas we've discussed. And if you ever need someone to listen again, please remember that the palace staff are here to support you in many different ways. Camilla also rose, feeling lighter than she had in months despite not having left the palace grounds. Sergeant Hayes, I want to thank you for seeing me as a person, rather than just a royal obligation this morning. Your kindness and wisdom have given me hope that I can find a better way forward. As they prepared to leave the small sitting room, Camilla made a decision. I'm going to go back and retrieve that letter I left for Charles. Instead of leaving it as an explanation for my disappearance, I'm going to use it as the starting point for an honest conversation about how we can make our life together more sustainable and fulfilling. Hayes smiled, proud of how she had transformed her moment of desperation into a plan for positive communication. That sounds like a wise approach, ma'am. Sometimes our lowest moments can become the foundation for our most important breakthroughs. They walked back through the palace corridors together, but the atmosphere was completely different from their earlier encounter. Instead of a guard apprehending someone trying to escape, they were two people who had worked together to find hope in a difficult situation. When they reached the area where Camilla would return to her quarters, she turned to Hayes one final time. Sergeant, this morning you could have simply reported what you saw and let others handle the situation. Instead, you chose to listen and help. That choice made all the difference for me. Hayes felt deeply moved by her gratitude. Ma'am, sometimes the most important part of protecting someone is helping them protect themselves. I'm honored that I could be here when you needed someone to listen. As Camilla walked toward her quarters, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was still facing the same external pressures and responsibilities, but she now had a different internal perspective on how to handle them. The bag in her hand no longer contained escape supplies. It held reminders of who she was and who she could continue to be within her royal role. Hayes returned to his regular duties, but the morning's events had changed his understanding of what it meant to serve and protect the royal family. Sometimes protection meant preventing physical threats, but sometimes it meant preventing someone from making decisions that would harm their long-term well-being. The conversation had reminded him that behind every public figure was a human being, with real struggles and genuine needs for connection and understanding. Months later, Camilla would often think back to that morning as a turning point in her royal life. She had learned to incorporate small moments of authenticity into her official schedule, had developed a closer relationship with Charles based on honest communication about their challenges, and had discovered that seeking help was a sign of strength rather than weakness. The crisis that could have ended in scandal had instead become the beginning of a more fulfilling and sustainable approach to royal service.